Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Nice to see all of you here. This is a very, very special treat for us to have Nathan Thrall here with us. Nathan is, of course, the author of the book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, which won the Pulitzer Prize this past year. Congratulations again, Nathan. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And, I've been trying to do this for a long time, and every time I say that, Nathan feels he needs to apologize, and I keep telling him he need not do that because he's been very busy doing incredibly important work. And Nathan was actually on a book tour with Abed Salama in the United States, and we were scheduled to meet when I was in New York for lunch on October 7, 2023. And then, of course, the world changed on October 7, and I think you and Abed went back to Jerusalem the next day.
We went to London, but eventually everything was cut short.
Yeah. Anyway, the book, how many of you have read the book? And it's okay, don't be embarrassed, because if you haven't, you will. Okay. So it's a fantastic book. It's a great book for many, many reasons. The book is started actually with a 20,000 words article with the same title in the New York Review of Books that appeared in 2021. And I think it's an amazing feat because in 217 pages, what you do is you take us on a journey of a deeply human story of Abed and his son who was on a bus, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But in telling this human story, you narrate the history and the present of Palestinian struggle. Phenomenal writing where you weave in characters and you take us sort of on a side trip, and we understand their history and then their relevance to the story, and it all connects incredibly well. And while you're doing that, you make it accessible for a reader who doesn't have the context, who doesn't know the history. You bring in Zionism, apartheid, colonial settlements, the Nakba, 1967, the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the Palestinian Authority and its corruption, and Fatah and Hamas and Islamism and so on. What you referred to me in a conversation yesterday as the vegetables that go with the main course, right? And you bring in a little bit of the meat and then you throw some vegetables on it, and you do that incredibly well. And you take us through story of love and marriage and family and parenthood, and you take us through the complicated sort of politics of apartheid and so on. So let me start by asking you, before we get into the subject of the book, why did you decide to take this route, right, as opposed to write a political book?
Yeah.
I mean, it is a political book,
yeah,
right? But it's primarily a human story, right? Why did you decide to do that as opposed to do something akin to writings that you had done before? For example, the book that you published a few years before then, The Only Language They Understand, or the piece in the New York Review of Books about Salam Fayyad back, more than a decade ago.
Yes.
Our Man in Palestine, which are very directly political. Why did you decide to pursue this path?
Yeah. Well, thank you for all of that. A pleasure to be with all of you. The idea of writing a book like this, before I even knew that it would be this specific book, really grew out of a sense of despair. I was working full-time on the issue of Palestine, and I was tasked in my job at the International Crisis Group with meeting diplomats and visiting politicians and policymakers, other journalists, think tank analysts, and I saw that not only was nothing changing, but also even when I spoke to these people privately, they were saying things that were totally at odds with not only the policies that they were supporting, but also what they were saying in public. And I felt that all of that work that I was doing, that analytical work, that argumentative work, while important, was never going to really bring about change. And even when I had met senior officials who told me that they had been persuaded by an argument that I had made, they would in the same breath say, and there's no chance that I'm going to act on that new understanding. And if you're talking about a senior U.S. official, they would say, the kinds of changes that are realistic are tiny, little bureaucratic changes that you, Nathan, deem insignificant. And even for those tiny little things, I'm going to get my head chopped off. I might lose my job. I might end my career. At a minimum, I'm going to have headaches for months. And it's simply not worth it. And so what I really decided was I needed to change the nature of the work that I was doing, and that what I felt was the most important kind of work that needed to be done on Palestine in general was changing the public perception of this issue, to change the basic understanding of the history and of the present. And the only way that I felt that you could really do that to reach a broad audience is through narrative. So in a way, I decided to write a book like this. I love literature, I love writing, but it was a very instrumental decision. I did it because I thought this is the most effective way to bring about the kind of change that I feel is necessary. The kind of change that's needed in Palestine is revolutionary change. And the whole conversation I was involved in for 10 years with International Crisis Group is about tinkering with the status quo, which is not going to change anything.
Right. And so let's talk about the subject of the book. I mean, in many ways, the book is devastating in its specificity, but universal in its implications, because you take an incident that took place around 9 a.m. In February 2012. What date was it?
February 16th.
February 16, 2012. So almost exactly 13 years ago. A bus carrying kindergartners, right?
Yes.
From an area that is, I don't know how you would describe it, because an area that was part of East Jerusalem, part of the West Bank. Israel did not want to have responsibility for it, and you go into also the maps around sort of designating where the apartheid wall was going to go, and the decision was made. There are too many Palestinians in that area. We don't want to be responsible for them, and we're going to block them off from Jerusalem, and the apartheid wall goes in, and then it's designated Area C, right, which is part of the West Bank, but it is under total control of Israel. So
Precisely.
Before we get into what happened on that day, talk to us about that geography.
Sure. So, I mean, part of what drew me to this particular story was the geography of it, because the thing that's very important to know is that Jerusalem is the heart of the settlement project. More than half of Israeli settlers live in the greater Jerusalem area. It's the number one priority area for Israeli settlement, and it's where they've been very successful in creating contiguous Jewish space. And of course, the main reason that it's a priority is because it's to prevent Palestinian statehood. And without Jerusalem, no Palestinian state. So the town of Anata, which is where Abed comes from, has had virtually every kind of Israeli land confiscation applied to it. Parts of it were annexed in 1967. In 1967, Israel annexed Jordanian East Jerusalem, which is the old city and its immediate surroundings, and the lands of over 24 surrounding villages. And again, the reason why I say the lands of, is because consistently the Israeli policy is maximum land, minimum Arabs. So what Israel would do is annex up to the center of an urban area, but not actually annex the urban area because it doesn't want the people, it wants the land. This is the famous saying uttered by a number of Israeli politicians, including the prime minister in 1967, Levi Eshkol, who said that in the 1967 war, we got a dowry, a very nice dowry, but we don't want the bride. And what that means is we want the land and not the people. And so Anatta had part of it annexed in 1967. It has had settlements built on it. It is now a tiny rump of its former size. It was once one of the most expansive towns in the West Bank, and now it's basically what was the dense area in 1967. It is now surrounded by walls on 4 sides. It has the concrete 26-foot tall apartheid wall on 3 sides, and a 4th side it has a wall running in the middle of a segregated road, Route 4370, famously known as the Apartheid Road. And it has it has a military base built on it. The base is built on Abed's family land. It has a natural part of the Israeli National Park Service. It has a spring that was taken over that's now Israelis from all over, not just settlers, will go and visit. And so the geography of the place really appealed to me. And what you were describing earlier is that this area, which is the town of Anatta and then a few neighborhoods next to it, including the Shuafat refugee camp, are all within this walled enclave, a walled ghetto in the center of Jerusalem. And
Abed Salama is one of them, Shafat.
Exactly. And Abed Salama is the part of Anatta that Israel annexed in 1967. So there's part of Anatta that Israel considers formally its sovereign territory. It considers it to be within the capital of the state. And parts of it are not. And it's just, 2 houses right next to each other. One is formally annexed, one is not annexed. You would need an expert to come and guide you and show you where the annexation line is, because half of this enclave is annexed, half of it is not annexed.
And just to make it clear, the one that's not annexed is in area C, right?
It's C and B, both.
C and B. And
yes.
Just to make sure that everybody understands,
so,
maybe
yes.
Let's explain A, B, C.
Absolutely. So after the first Intifada, Israel had a quiet occupation for the first 2 decades, with pockets of resistance, but a very easy occupation for Israel for the first 2 decades. And then, to Israel's surprise, the first Intifada broke out in December 1987, and this changed the view of leading Israeli decision makers about how they were going to control the Palestinians. And the defense minister at the time, who later became the prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister at the time of Oslo, he's on record telling his closest advisors that he decided, as a result of this sustained unarmed uprising by Palestinians, that Israel would no longer rule over Palestinian city centers directly, and it would rule over them indirectly by giving Palestinians limited autonomy. So it was out of that uprising that the Palestinian Authority was created. And in 1994, this new authority emerges, and then the West Bank is carved up into 3 zones in addition to the territory that's already been annexed in 1967, which is, of course, outside of Oslo. And those three zones are known as Area A, B, and C. And broadly speaking, Area A was for the urban city centers, the places where Israel didn't want its own troops, administering large numbers of Palestinians. But still, Israel, of course, goes into Area A all the time, makes arrests in Area A, but it allows Palestinians to control health and education.
So that's Ramallah, Beit Lahem.
The big cities.
The big cities,
yes.
and which contain the majority of the Palestinians living in the West Bank. But in terms of landmass, it's
about 20%.
Yep.
And in terms of landmass so I'll get to that in a second. Area B is kind of medium-sized villages, and that's another roughly 20%. And then Area C, which I say roughly for the others because Area C is about 62%. Area C is 62% of the West Bank, and Area C is where Israel not only has full security control, but full administrative control. So that means that any Palestinian who wants to, build a balcony, build a new room on their house, build an outhouse, any kind of construction requires Israeli permission, which is almost never granted. And so what happens is Palestinians are forced to build without a permit. Israel then comes and destroys anything that Palestinians build in Area C, and meanwhile, right next to them, both officially approved and not officially approved Jewish construction is blossoming. Now, Area A and B combined are about 40%, Area C is about 60%, but just to kind of zoom out on the big picture, if we look at the territory under Israel's control, if we look at mandatory Palestine, Israel is the sole sovereign over mandatory Palestine. Pre-1967 Israel is 78% of that territory. What is called the occupied territories, the territories Israel conquered in 1967, are 22%. The autonomy areas for Palestinians, where Palestinians have direct administrative control, meaning Gaza and Area A and B in the West Bank, all together, those make up 10% of the territory under Israel's control. And that 10% is a series of scattered little islands. So Area A and B are 165 little islands in a sea of Area C control. Every Israeli settlement, every Israeli settler road, all the settler infrastructure, all of that is Area C. Any place you'd find an Israeli in the West Bank, not including the annexed areas, which Israel considers its sovereign territory, is Area C. And then you have dotted within it these tiny little islands that Israel, of course, enters at will.
And altogether, they make around 10%.
Around 10%,
yeah.
Yes.
And that's where, in Area BC, is where the accident takes place. So let's go back to February 16, 2012. The bus loaded with kindergartners from Anata and surrounding area.
And
right?
many of them from Shuafat.
And many
from the camp.
Shafat refugee camp,
Yeah.
right? It's a very, very rainy day.
Yes.
It's hazardous driving conditions. And
Yeah.
on Jabba Road, today we were having lunch with some students who go to Al-Quds Bard University. And, they're, of course, very familiar with it and oftentimes take that road. It is, if I understand correctly, you've got 2 lanes in one direction, 1 lane in another direction, no divider, and only Israel can address that issue, right? The Palestinian Authority has no control over Jabal.
Not allowed. Not allowed on it. This is an area, the PA isn't allowed in Area C, and Israel, gives traffic tickets on this road. Often we're told the story of, there's Israel, and then there's the separate regime run by the military in the occupied territories. But the reality isn't like that. It's Israeli National Police who are giving tickets out in Area C. You know, it's the Israeli Ministry of Transportation that's paving the roads in Area C. This whole notion that there's a separable democratic Israel within the 78%, and then there's a separate military occupation is totally at odds with reality.
Right. And the bus was taking the kids to a park, right? Which under normal circumstances is reachable within minutes, right? But because they have to go around the settlements, they have to go on Jabba Road, right?
And because the students themselves come from different backgrounds. Some of them live in the parts of this walled ghetto that have been annexed. So they come from families that have blue Jerusalem IDs. So they have the ability to pass through a checkpoint. And if all of the students came from such families and all the teachers and the bus driver did too, then they could go through the checkpoint and go to a play area just on the other side of the wall, right next to them. When you're inside this enclave, you peek through the space between two buildings and you are looking in one direction. You look up at the manicured grounds of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the most prestigious university in Israel, that's looking down on this walled ghetto. In the other direction, you're looking at the settlement of Pisgat Ze'ev, with its red-roofed upper-middle-class homes and green playgrounds. Meanwhile, inside this walled enclave, you don't have sidewalks. The roads are in disrepair. People are forced to burn their trash in the street in the middle of the night, and you certainly don't have any playgrounds.
Right. And so this bus is heading to its direction on Jabba Road, and is hit by a speeding 18-wheeler, an Israeli 18-wheeler. Now, the bus itself had problems, right? Because it didn't have the proper license, right? It had lots of issues associated with it. It flips and it catches fire because of wood paneling inside the bus, right? And what happens then? And Abed's son, so Abed Salama, his son Milad, is on the bus.
So, the bus flipped over on its side and it caught fire. And this happens on a road that is used almost entirely by Palestinians. It was originally built as a bypass road for settlers. The bypass road meaning that initially, the road system in the West Bank was connecting the major city centers. But now that Israel's in charge, what their primary concern are the settlements, not Nablus and Ramallah. And so the main road network is now supplanted by a series of bypass roads which allow settlers not to have to travel through the middle of populated Palestinian areas, and also not to see them, to ignore them, to give themselves the illusion that there's a continuous Jewish presence from their home to their workplace in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or what have you. And so the bus flips over, it catches fire, and it's all Palestinians on this road. The PA is not allowed to go onto it. People start calling frantically for the emergency services to come. There is a doctor, a woman by the name of Huda Dahbour, who works for the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, who's leading a small medical team on their way to a Bedouin community. And she instructs the driver to pull over on the side of the road. They get out and they try and assist with this burning bus, but people are helpless to assist because they have, at best, a tiny little fire extinguisher in the trunk of their car, and the flames are rising very, very high above this bus, and it's only getting worse, and people are desperate. There's a man who hits himself in the head because he doesn't know what to do. These fire extinguishers are doing nothing in the face of these flames. And there was one man in particular named Salam, who heroically...
He was in the car with Huda, wasn't he? Salam,
no? He was beside her outside the bus, but he came there separately. He lives very close to where The accident took place, and to the shock of the people in this crowd, he just climbs in this burning bus. And one of the teachers climbed in as well with him, Ola Julani. And they start pushing these kindergartners out through the windows above them, because the bus is flipped over its side, and also through the back. And they rescued heroically dozens of children. It was more than 30 minutes before the first Israeli fire truck arrived at the scene. When Abed learned that there was a crash, he still wasn't sure that it was from his son's school or that his son was on it. And he raced with a cousin to the accident site.
He wasn't sure the son was on it because there were two buses that were heading out of the school.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And he raced out to the scene of this crash, and the Israelis are not allowing any cars to come onto the road. They've now secured the area. Huda's driver had run to the nearby checkpoint, very close by, and begged the soldiers there to help, and they refused. And Abed got out of his cousin's car and starts racing toward the accident site. And he flags down an Israeli Jeep that's coming toward him, and he says, my son was on one of those buses, and they refused to take him. And he runs to the scene of the accident. And when he gets there, he sees an enormous crowd. He can't even see the bus at first. And then he looks through this crowd, and he sees an empty shell of a bus, a burned out shell of a bus, and he doesn't see any children there. And he's asking people in the crowd, where are the children? And they tell him all kinds of different answers. They're at one hospital in East Jerusalem. They're at another hospital in West Jerusalem. They're at the military base a minute up the road. They're at the Ramallah hospital. Some went as far as Nablus. And Abed himself has a green West Bank ID. He can't travel through those checkpoints to go and check for his son at the East Jerusalem hospitals, at the West Jerusalem hospitals. He certainly can't enter the military base a minute up the road, so he goes to the one place that he is able to go, which is the Ramallah hospital. And for the next more than a day, he just tries to find where his son is. He calls relatives who have a blue ID, because the families in this area are all mixed up. Some have the blue ID, some have the green. And he calls relatives to go to the hospitals in East Jerusalem where he's told his son is, and go and find him and check on him. And it takes him more than a day just to find out where his son is, what has happened to his son. And there were other stories like that. And the book is called A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, but it's not just the story of Abed, it's the story of other parents, of some of the teachers, of some of the emergency service personnel, of the founder of the settlement next to where the accident took place, of the architect of the wall, who decided actually that Abed's whole community was going to be surrounded by a wall. They didn't need to put it there. They decided not to follow their own unilaterally declared municipal boundary, which they created in 1967 with their act of annexation, because, again, the goal is maximum land, minimum Arabs. So they took the opportunity of this densely populated area. We're going to carve it off. Even though part of it is our annexed sovereign territory, they don't treat it as their own annexed sovereign territory if it's filled with Palestinians. So they carve it off, and those people then lose their ability to travel freely to the center of the city in which they were born and raised.
So your choice of the accident, the bus on that day, you said the geography, right?
Yes.
And the implications of the geography. And you started talking about the respondents not showing up until 31 minutes after this happened.
Yes.
Talk to us some more about that, and what happens when people from the Palestinian Authority show up, right? What happens there? What happens then? What does that moment sort of in the 15 minutes to the hour, if you will, after the bus rolls over, what do we learn about the entrapment, about the conditions that are there?
Well, it just happened to be the case that Abed's cousin was a pretty senior figure in the Palestinian Authority Ministry of Interior. Ibrahim. And he had an office very close, actually, to the accident site, and a grandfather of one of the children on the bus had seen the accident take place, or had seen the immediate aftermath of the accident, and was on his way to this office, and he told Ibrahim, who works in the Ministry of Interior, that there is this accident right next to you, and it's not in Ibrahim's jurisdiction. This is an Israeli jurisdiction, but it's a bus. This is a road used primarily by Palestinians, and he goes with his deputies and races to the scene of the accident, and there is a confrontation that takes place there with the Israeli soldiers, and because of the scale of this tragedy, something unprecedented happened. I don't think it's ever happened before or since, where the Israeli commander there agreed with Ibrahim that they would give them a kind of a jurisdiction to deal with the accident, even though it's in Area C. And one of the the themes of the book is really about also the Palestinian Authority and what it means to have somebody like Abed who grew up in the First Intifada, was an activist in the First Intifada, became a local leader of one of the left factions in his town, to see a close relative join the Palestinian Authority, the security forces, and work hand in glove with Israelis. Ibrahim has close friends who are Israeli generals, and so I think that a big part of why Ibrahim is in the book is because this is a central issue for Palestinians in the West Bank, and Abed is honest about his very strong feelings about what the PA is doing and how it's thwarting Palestinian objectives.
Right. Abed was in the National Front, right, for the liberation of Palestine.
He was in the Democratic Front.
Democratic Front.
Yeah.
He spent time in jail. It almost, the way I remember it, almost every Palestinian character in the book had spent some time in jail.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Bring us into that.
So I might actually just read a short passage where, during the First Intifada, Abed was arrested and taken to prison, like so many young men at that time. After his interrogation, Abed was sent to the Ofer prison near Ramallah, then to a detention facility in the Anatot base, which, as it happened, was built on land confiscated from his family. Detainees used buckets as toilets. Abed stayed there for 2 months and was allowed to shower only twice. Next, he went back to Ofer, where he was tried and sentenced by a military court to 6 months, then to Dahariya again, and finally out of the West Bank to Israel's largest prison, Ketziot, in the Negev desert. It was built to confine the thousands of West Bank and Gaza Palestinians rounded up during the Intifada, at a certain point holding 1 in every 50 Palestinian men. Politically aware inmates named it Ansar III after the Ansar prison camp Israel had erected when it occupied southern Lebanon, but most referred to it by the Arabic name for the area since before Israel colonized it, the Nakab. Abed arrived in the Nakab in the winter, when the temperature of the desert nights would drop below freezing. The facility was made up of more than 100 crowded tents with a couple dozen detainees in each. Every cluster of 2 to 4 tents was surrounded by a dirt mound and enclosed with barbed wire. It was easier for Israel to control the inmates by giving some autonomy to the factions, allowing each to run its own tent. In Abed's cluster, there was one tent for the DFLP, one for Fatah, and one for the Islamists. When new prisoners were brought in, they would line up before the heads of the factions and declare their party affiliation. Not everyone had one, so this was the moment when they had to decide. Abed saw one prisoner approach the front of the line and declare, "I'm with the PLO." Everyone around him laughed. "We're all PLO," one of the party leaders said, since the PLO was not a faction, but the umbrella group for all the non-Islamist parties. "Okay, I'm with Abu Ammar," the man offered, using the kunya or honorific for Yasser Arafat. He was put with Fatah. 2 months later, Abed saw that this man, who had not known the name of the faction he joined, was now the head of Fatah education in his cluster. That, Abed thought, is how they choose their leaders. At the time, nearly half of the 13,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails were in the Nakab. The inmates included most of the more than 2,000 Palestinians held under administrative detention, that is, held without having been charged or tried, and with the possibility that their sentence might be extended indefinitely. Among them were journalists, attorneys, physicians, professors, students, trade unionists, civil society leaders, advocates of nonviolence, and members of Israeli PLO dialogue groups, which were illegal. Unlike Abed, most were not told the reasons for their imprisonment. Each tent set its own daily schedule. Abed's DFLP tent held mandatory courses in party objectives, policies, and ideology, and instruction on how to withstand interrogation by the Shabak. Some inmates read and translated newspaper articles brought in by their lawyers. Televisions and radios were forbidden. Great numbers of books were banned, from Shakespeare, Tolkien, and Tolstoy to Solzhenitsyn and the constitutional law of the State of Israel, and none of the prisoners were allowed a family visit. The tents had no tables or chairs, and they flooded when it rained. Even during dust and sandstorms, the soldiers required the tent flaps to remain open. The barrels used for trash overflowed each day, bringing a terrible stench and an influx of mosquitoes and rats. Many prisoners developed skin diseases. But the real torment came at sunset. Each night the Israelis would turn on the speakers and play a heart-rending ballad by Kulthum. She was Abed's favorite singer, along with Abdel Halim Hafez. He disliked pop music and listened only to the classics. The Israelis played a different wrenching Kulthum song each night. Her songs were lengthy. The most famous, Anta Omri, You Are My Life, was almost an hour long. The anguished prisoners would lie on their beds listening, homesick, some of them crying, others working on the one letter they were allowed to send each month. Abed didn't dare try to write to Ghazal. The Israelis read all the mail, and who knew how they would use the information against him or her. Instead, he would stand outside the tent and look up at the moon, wondering if at that moment Ghazal was looking at it too.
He looked at the moon and wondered whether Ghazal was looking at it at the same time too. So Ghazal is one of 4 names, I think, in the book that is not the real name of the character. Who's Ghazal?
You know, a big part of this book is a love story. And the real center of the first part of this book is Abed's first love, and how that love was thwarted, and how the chain of events that followed. That breakup led to the birth of his son and how he was brought back to those moments on this day, the worst day of his life, as he's wondering what has become of his son. And through the story of Ghazal and Abed, we get a sense of what life was like at that time in the West Bank, prior to the creation of the PA, and during and just before the First Intifada.
You could have picked another parent, right? Another distraught parent who's looking for their child. There's Nancy, right?
Yes.
And her son Salah.
Yes.
Why Abed? Was geography also part of it?
It was a part of it, but it's funny because I think I mentioned to you that when Abed first read the book, he said to me, Nancy's story is much more tragic than mine. Why did you choose me? Why isn't this a day in the life of Nancy? And there are a few different answers to that, but one of the main ones is that I had two ambitions with this book. And one was that I wanted to reach people emotionally. I felt that my experience watching people come to Palestine was that the emotional impact of seeing segregation, domination, oppression was much more important, long-lasting, deeper than all of the intellectual, historical arguments. And so that was key for me. And I even said to my editor when I started this project, I said, the only way we're going to make a dent is if we create something that makes people cry. And the other ambition that I had was that people who don't know much about Israel-Palestine would come away with it learning a lot, and that they would understand two things. One, the system of apartheid, how it actually works, not in an abstract way, not in a legal way, not from a bird's eye view, but how it looks and feels for the people living under it, how it actually works for these parents navigating this system on this day. And the second thing is I wanted to give a history of Israel-Palestine through the lives and family histories of these people.
Right.
And the reason that Abed is at the center of this book is because I could tell the whole Palestinian story through his family. He was born just after the occupation began. He graduated high school just before the First Intifada broke out. He participated in the Intifada. He became a local leader. He was tortured. He was imprisoned. And he started to experience, as after being released from prison, restrictions on his movement that were the beginnings of what would become this elaborate permit regime that came into place with Oslo. And for that reason, among others, he was against Oslo, and he foresaw that it was actually going to be something that was going to make Palestinian life worse.
Right.
And so through all of these stories, and also just, Abed really exemplifies the degree to which this system dictates life outcomes. He didn't go to college. He was a promising student. He writing poetry. He wanted to be a lawyer and help defend Palestinian prisoners. And he never got to go to college. All the West Bank universities were shut down during the First Intifada. And at one point, even when he had a job in the 1990s, as this permit regime is becoming more and more intense, he and his fellow co-workers who are working in Jerusalem, where the higher paying jobs are at risk of losing their jobs. And the one way that they could keep their jobs is if they married a woman who had a blue ID. And several of them, including Abed, went and sought marriage partners in order to keep their jobs. And that was another reason that, Abed was at the center of this book.
Yeah. And I mean, I said, the book is incredibly accessible. You have an incredible way of narrating and bringing it all together, that it's an easy read in that sense, but it's also a very, very, very hard read. I mean, it weighs on you, the sadness, the agony, and not only the search for the children, and then, and the death and destruction and so on, but just the daily grind of life there. And I think you, in a way, spared us also, because Abed is right. I mean, her story is in a way harder.
Yeah.
And I think if you went into it in more detail, it would have been even harder.
Yes.
Before we turn to the audience, and I do want to take us a couple of places and talk about the reactions to the book, and then talk about your own journey.
Sure.
Okay? But before we leave the book, I think it's in the, or correct me if I'm wrong, you talk about a journalist who worked for the Israeli Channel 10.
That's right.
Who did a program, Palestinians murdered, ha ha ha, something like that.
An Arab kid died, ha 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 ha.
Yeah. Which really documents and journalist was upset, was moved by very negatively by what many in Israeli society were putting on social media about the accident and the death, right? I'd like you to expand on that, but he goes and interviews some of the people who shamelessly posted, not anonymously. I mean, they put their names out there.
That's right.
And there's a conversation that he has with somebody who looks like anybody I knew in New York, right? I mean, a secular-looking young man, athletic, wearing an Abercrombie & Fitch T-shirt, right? And he asks him, did you really put that out there? And the guy unabashedly says, yes. And he says, did you mean what you put there? And he says, 100%. And then he calls up his friends who were playing basketball or something and asks them, how would you feel? Would you be happy if you learned about Palestinian children dying in an accident or any other way? And they say 100%.
Yes.
You live in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
How much of that, that really caught me, because you'd always want to hope that things are different, that at a human level, things are different. I think about those kids. I think about the kids who was a teenager probably at the time, 2012, who wore the Abercrombie & Fitch T-shirt. He's now in his 20s.
Yeah.
He's probably killing children in Gaza.
Exactly.
And his family and his friends are cheering him on.
Yeah. Yeah. I wrote the book before October 7th. And it was very important for me to include this television program that was created about the reaction among young people to the accident. Not because it represents all of Israeli society, it doesn't, but it is a very important trend. It's a very important group of people that has grown enormously over the last 13 years. And moreover, it shows the degree of dehumanization, which was at the center of this liberal anchor's decision to create a television special about this event. He wanted to understand, how is it that we had reached this point of dehumanizing Palestinians to the degree that people can celebrate openly without a pseudonym the death of innocent kindergartners in a bus accident, burning to death. And what we see today, of course, is that dehumanization has become mainstream. And we have the president, who is considered a center-left figure in Israel, once the leader of the Labor Party in Israel, who says there are no innocents in Gaza. I'm I had no prediction of what was going to happen, but I'm very glad that is an important part of the book, because alas, it's only growing in size, that phenomenon.
How has the book been received? I mean, obviously it received the Pulitzer Prize in 2024, no less. I mean, in the middle of all of this. Tell us briefly about some of the pleasant surprises, besides winning the Pulitzer, in terms of how it's been received, and maybe some of the cancellations. And you took some stands, right? You refused to speak at places, can't remember, some university in the Midwest that wanted you to sign something or another.
Yeah.
So talk to us about that experience, and let's bring into this your experience at Bard College in New York, teaching a course on apartheid that became incredibly controversial,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And Leo Botstein, I think you shared with me yesterday, Leon Botstein has been president of Bard College for 50 years now.
Since the 70s, yeah.
Yeah. So if it's not 50, it's 48 or 49 years. And he said it's the most expensive course he's ever allowed to teach at Bard, because of the millions of dollars it cost him in terms of donors pulling their funding from Bard College. Anyway, within that context, I mean, tell us.
He said it gives new meaning to the phrase standing on principle.
Yeah.
Standing on capital and standing on principle, because they did stand by me. They did allow the course to continue, and they refused any of these demands to change the title, to all of these to cancel it. One of the things that was most upsetting to me about that incident was that people weren't outraged by this interference by the state of Israel. It was the consulate in New York, was petitioning a college in the U.S. about a class that's being offered there. Russia has never dared, China has never dared, and no country has dared to try and intervene in the curriculum because there's a course that's critical of them. But people just accepted that, of course, Israel's going to try and cancel this class, and pro-Israel groups, the ADL, was very active in trying to cancel the class. The event that happened in Arkansas was something that's very important, because in the U.S., in dozens of states in the U.S., state legislatures have passed laws that say that anyone who's contracting with the state must pledge not to participate in boycotts of Israel. And because I was going to go and speak at the University of Arkansas, which is a state institution, and Arkansas is one of the states that has passed these laws, they demanded that if I was going to come and speak there, I had to sign a pledge that I wouldn't boycott Israel, and I refused to do it. And it should be said that the faculty there who invited me were embarrassed that this law exists. They're supported me in refusing to sign it. But you have many cases in the U.S. Like this, where people who have don't think about Palestine at all in their lives, but suddenly being asked to sign a statement that you're going to do electrical work at a municipal building or something, and you have to sign a statement about not boycotting. You're allowed to boycott to boycott whatever you want, but if I'm going to sign a pledge for this one place. So, as you might imagine, after October 7th, there were a number of cancellations. Abed and I were going to be on we planned to be on tour together for 6 weeks. We were going to be in the U.S. and the U.K. In the U.K., the biggest event that we had planned for the whole tour was at a big hall in London called Conway Hall, and the U.K. police shut down that event. And this was in the immediate aftermath of October 7th and the days after. But I didn't hear of, they were targeting anything with Palestinian in the title. So there was a traditional music concert in a church in London that same week that they also canceled. But I did not hear of a single case where the UK police was shutting down a pro-Israel event.
Good.
And you see it everywhere to this day. I share an editor with Rashid Khalidi, your former colleague at Columbia, and his book and my book. Amazon bans our publisher from doing sponsored ads. The number one place that you do ads for a book is Amazon. It's the most effective place to do an ad, and Amazon bans them as political. I've gone on the Amazon page for my book, and I see ads for very political pro-Israel books.
Of course. Yeah.
You just see it everywhere. You see it everywhere. And as a journalist, I dealt with it too. I used to have an editor at the New York Times opinion page reach out to me and say, would you, write a piece on X, whatever's happening? And and he would say to me, I have to tell you, I'm asking you to do this, even though I know this is going to take weeks out of my life. It's going to take weeks out of my life after the piece is published. Why is it going to take weeks out of my life after it's published? Because there are organizations with paid staff members that are devoted to harassing these editors after a piece that they don't like comes out, because they know how the system works. And at these newspapers, they take seriously any demand for a correction, for a factual correction. So they have to frame, even if it's totally ideological, there's no factual issue, they have to frame it as a factual dispute. And then they drag these people into week-long email chains, directing them to sources that they're not familiar with. And, these people are not experts on Israel-Palestine. And it's a nightmare for them. They don't know, it sucks up hours and hours of their day, and it has a huge deterrent effect. This guy really cared about Palestine, but for somebody who cares just a little bit less, they're not going to assign the piece in the first place. In the opposite direction, there's no cost. There is no full-time, organization with paid staff members trying to do the same thing on the Palestinian side. And also when it comes to organized political money in the U.S., I had somebody in the Biden administration say to me recently, he said, every issue in Washington, you have organized political money on both sides of it. Take like the most ridiculous things. What's pickleball? There's organized political money on both sides of pickleball, But on Palestine, there's almost nothing, and then you have this whole potpourri of huge pro-Israel organizations with a lot of power. So. It's a very, very far from an even playing field.
Had we had more time, I would love for us to talk more about this and talk about pick your brain on whether you see this changing and, if it's backfiring, the more you oppress free speech, the more that this has become evident, the more the masks are off, whether we have something to hope for. We don't have time to get into that, but maybe just a couple of words as to whether you see hope or you see things actually getting worse.
Without any hesitation, things are going to get worse. Near and medium term, things are going to get worse. the trends over the last decades are very clear. It's a process of continuous Israeli-Jewish expansion and constriction of Palestinians into smaller and smaller places. And that is a process that's in turbo drive right now. You know, in a year after October 7th, Israel confiscated more Palestinian land in the West Bank than in the previous 20 years combined. So this is a process that's in overdrive, and there is, if you look on the horizon, what is the countervailing force? I don't see it. Do I draw hope and inspiration from young people and from protests and the campus protests? And absolutely. I think it's so important, and I do actually draw inspiration from it. But that's a very long-term hope. Those people may have political power in 20 years, and I hope that they do, and that we see some real changes that come from it. But my basic view is a very, very negative one about the immediate future, with some kind of optimism about the very long term.
Thank you. The microphones are with them, but no, I'm not ready yet. I have one more question for Nathan. One more. And that is, at a personal level, Nathan, you were apolitical until you were in your 20s. Israel, Palestine did not even factor into your life.
Yeah.
What took you on this journey and landed you here?
So I'll try to be short with that answer.
I know.
But it actually, it happened to be the case that a car accident in my own life brought me to Palestine. My grandparents, who were very close to me, raised me as much as my own parents, got in a car accident after visiting me in Los Angeles. And my grandmother passed away. My grandfather survived. And I quit my job. I moved back home. We were grieving. We weren't prepared. We were just dealing with the aftermath. And in that time, my mom said, "Why don't you take one of these free trips to Israel?" And I hadn't even heard of Birthright at that time. I knew virtually nothing. And she said something that I never heard my grandmother say to me, but she said, "Your grandmother always wanted to live with you for a year in Jerusalem." So I took one of these...
And your mother's family, it was Russian Jewish.
Russian Jewish, exactly. My mom was born and raised in Armenia, but they were Russian Jews who moved there just before she was born. And so I took this trip. And at that time, again, I was so ignorant, I didn't even know that the name Birthright was offensive. I didn't even know, I wasn't even questioning the notion that I, an American Jew born and raised in the U.S. with no thought or care about Israel, have a so-called birthright to go wherever I want, get citizenship immediately, live there, get all kinds of subsidies, and I could do it on, in a Palestinian home. I could do it, and Palestinians, millions of them, can't even enter, not just pre-67 Israel, but anywhere in Palestine, and so then I changed my whole trajectory at that point, and I went to grad school. I went to Columbia, where you were. And when I finished, I came and I started to work as a journalist. And again, it was a very slow process for me of learning and unlearning. And it wasn't, overnight. It really took a long time. And I like to say that behind every story of an American Zionist or American Jew who has read and learned and changed their thinking and become a non-Zionist or an anti-Zionist, is a whole row of very, very patient Palestinians. And I'm like embarrassed to think about things I might have said to all of these people who are so kind to me and who were patient with me and listened to me and heard horrible things from me, I'm sure. And, when I first came to Palestine, when I first came to Gaza in 2010, I think I was already pretty far on my way, but I'd never been to Gaza. And I came there as a kind of trial period with International Crisis Group. They wanted me to write a first report for them, see if they wanted to hire me. And I met a lifelong friend who's here today who left Gaza just earlier last spring. And he embraced me, and his family embraced me, and he taught me, almost everything I know. And I owe him the world and many other people.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you. Let's take some questions. Okay, let's start with the woman there. Yeah. Yes. There are mics going around.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. Thank you so much. I really, really loved this book a lot. Thank you for writing it. I have a lot of questions, but maybe just one that I'll ask right now. You briefly tonight mentioned UNRWA, and UNRWA does come up a few times in the book. We're getting very close now to the, if not now already, to the cutoff for the implementation of the law kind of banning UNRWA's operations, whatever that means. So I would just maybe be interested to hear a little bit about UNRWA at the time of the accident and writing the book, and then maybe some of your perceptions or thoughts about it as we're on the precipice of this law possibly being implemented in some way about UNRWA's operations. Thanks.
Sure.
As many of you know, UNRWA is essential to providing services, particularly in Gaza, where more than 70% of the population are refugees. And it will be disastrous for Palestinians if UNRWA is no longer able to operate. All of these years, Israel was constantly launching a campaign against UNRWA because they are operating under the mistaken belief that if UNRWA doesn't exist, Palestinians are no longer going to think of themselves, Palestinian refugees are no longer going to think of themselves as refugees, and that the whole reason that the refugee issue exists is because UNRWA is perpetuating it, which of course is nonsense. But at the same time, it was just a rhetorical stand that they took. Privately, they would always admit they wanted UNRWA there because UNRWA makes the occupation easier for them. Like every actor that's working in the occupied territories is making the occupation easier for them. It's doing things that they actually are responsible for, should be paying for, and aren't paying for as the occupying power. And so I really don't know what's going to happen in the coming days. It's possible that some other arrangement will be made where other international organizations or even other parts of the UN will take over some of that work. But Israel has been really driving a very strong campaign against not just UNRWA, but the UN in general, and has not been giving a lot of the work permits that it used to give to UN employees in the occupied territories. So I don't know what to say other than it is a very dire thing for UNRWA not to be able to provide services anymore. And in the past, I might have said, Israel doesn't want a humanitarian disaster to occur. The ideology is not that strong that they're going to follow through on this rhetoric and allow the collapse of UNRWA. It's ultimately bad for them. But today, they see that they can have the worst humanitarian disasters occur, and nobody's doing anything. So I think it actually seems to them much less costly to make it even worse.
Hello. Thank you so much for this talk, this conversation. I love the cadence of it all. And Dean Safwan, you had asked the initial question about the sort of Nathan's pathway and how you got to where you are today. But I wanted to sort of follow up on that question, the personal, and ask you maybe to reflect a little bit more on sort of how, because you're in a unique position of someone who may have thought differently and grew up in a different sort of environment and then have come to this, and just thinking of, well, why is it that, or how is it that people change? I know that there are anti-Zionists who actually switched in Israel, right? Who kind of took steps back, for example. So I don't know if you can reflect on what are the sort of things that would make people sort of become anti-Zionist, and maybe in Israeli society, as much as you may know. I don't know if you still live there. Or,
I do.
Sort of what makes you pessimistic?
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's maybe a difficult question in terms of trying to reflect on these questions of change and how one kind of.
Thanks, Sally. Actually, maybe related to that, I mean, when we had the Reimagining Palestine conference, one of the themes was there are connections with Jewish allies, anti-Zionist allies, in the U.S., and that's where, but very little, it seems, has been done to create inroads within Israel.
Yeah. So I'm going to say something that's a little bit contradictory. On one hand, I very much believe in the power of storytelling, and I really do believe that you can bring about change through storytelling. And I've somebody, the prominent anti-Zionist artist in New York, wrote to me recently and said, I've been trying to convince my mom that it's apartheid. She's Jewish for 10, 15 years, and she just read your book and she's convinced. And so, I do believe in the power of, what I'm doing. At the same time, I have zero hope that change is going to come from within in Israel. I don't believe that the change that's going to happen is going to be through a process of ideological conversion inside Israel, or even moral shaming or moral argumentation or anything along those lines. I think that change is going to happen when you make it rational for Israel to take a different path. And at present, it's rational for Israel to be on the path that it's on. As I said, there's nothing on the horizon to stop it, and it's succeeding. And it is within our power to make it rational so that Israel faces for the first time a choice. All of these years we've been told by diplomats that it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable. It can't go on like this forever. Israel is eventually going to have to choose one way or another. It's going to have to either give Palestinians citizenship or statehood, one or the other. And Israel just laughs because it has a third choice, which is expanding Israeli Jewish settlement, constricting Palestinians into tighter and tighter places, implementing apartheid, and that's the alternative. It doesn't actually have to choose between those things, and you can make it so that Israel has to choose. if Israel felt that the path that it was on had costs, if it felt that, the only way that I am going to get out of sanctions or the loss of military aid from the U.S. or the loss of the UN Security Council veto from the U.S. or, traveling to Europe without a visa or having Israeli soccer teams, play in the European League. These are all things that Israelis care about. And it's possible to use that leverage and to say, if you want those things, you do have a choice now. But that we're eons away from that. I mean, look at Europe, where I think most of public opinion in Europe, I would guess if you polled people, they would say, of course, I don't want Israeli settlement products in our stores. But the most basic thing of boycotting Israeli settlement products, we can't even dream of having that in Europe in the near future. The debate is about labeling. So I think that the change is going to happen because Israel is going to be forced to take a different path. And that also means that it's not dependent on the Israeli left coming to power. It's not dependent on these internal dynamics. It's a choice that will be made rationally by the most right-wing Israelis.
We have time for a couple of more questions. Yes, please.
Happy New Year all, and welcome to beautiful Doha.
Thank you.
My question is regarding the ambitions that you have indicated in writing the books, the two ambitions, the emotional and the historical learning. Are there any third ambitions involved here, such as maybe turning the book into a motion picture, especially if it's approached by directors such as Steven Spielberg?
I would be very frightened of Steven Spielberg touching this project.
Are you offering to produce it?
But there has been some interest, and I would love for either a film or a series to come out of it. I would love nothing more. My experience so far is that there are a lot of people who talk a lot in Hollywood, and it's a very slow process to actually get anything made. So if you have connections and you know someone who's interested, I'm all ears.
Safwan.
Anyone else? John? Anyone else? Let me just...
There's somebody in the back here.
Oh, wow. Okay, so there are three. Okay, so I'm going to go to all three of you and then we'll stop.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask you a question because you are an American Jew advocating for Palestine, and we know obviously how American Jews also have these challenges, like being pressed against them for their own pro-Palestinian views. I wanted to ask if you could share those experiences with us, like what does it mean to be an American Jew who is advocating for Palestine? Has that burnt bridges with certain people, like friends and family members, for example?
I'll say two things. One is, yes, there have been bridges burned, and my mom can't read anything that I write and doesn't, and family members who wouldn't talk to me. That all exists. At the same time, in my work, I really am trying to write about Palestinians, and I don't really like the foregrounding of the difficulty of this for American Jews. I think there's a real thing that's happening, not just with Jews, in human relationships over Palestine. I've given talks in different places, members of church groups raising their hands and saying, at work I'm trying to say something about Palestine and I'm offending this person. How do I speak openly without offending? And there are real there's a process of relationships fraying over this issue, but I think that what we need, especially now, but at all times, is really to foreground this gross injustice that so supersedes all of these irrelevant, they matter to individual people, but they're so small in scale compared to the injustice that we're talking about. And for that reason, I've always been kind of reluctant, really, to talk about my own background and all of that. I really want to highlight the stories of the people who are actually really suffering.
So there were two hands up here, gentlemen, and there was, yes, and you. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Nathan, I'm an educator, a librarian, and a parent educator at a partner institution here in Education City. And one of the things that struck me about your background that you commented on at the early part of the evening was how you chose deliberately to use storytelling as a mechanism to leverage the injustices and to educate, inform, advocate, etc. So for those students in the audience or those students who read your book, young professionals, and even fellow educators, what do you want to say to them in terms of their own career path? What messaging can you offer in terms of where they should go with their own advocacy, with their own goals to make a difference, right? If it's not ICG, if it's not United Nations, or if in those organizations, how can they leverage storytelling to be impactful in their work going forward?
Thank you for that. I don't want to denigrate important work that is done in other spheres. It's absolutely essential that other work be done in the legal sphere, in the think tank sphere, and even in having like-minded people enter positions in governments that are supporting terrible policies to bring change from within. I once met an official and questioned him on his government's policies, and he was kind of defending the fact that he's working for this government, but he was aware of the contradictions, and he said to me, maybe a joke you guys have heard, but it's what did the cat say to the canary? You can change things from the inside. But so I do think that those other spheres are very important in addition to storytelling, and I think that it really depends on the area that you're working on. What I was really making an argument about is specifically with respect to the Palestinian issue. We're not in a space where incremental change is what's needed. And that said, I do have a very, very dear friend named Omar Shaker, who is the Israel-Palestine director for Human Rights Watch.
Who's been on the stage a couple of times.
He entered an institution, the leading human rights organization in the world, Human Rights Watch. And, you probably wouldn't want me to say this on the stage, but, he single-handedly implemented a revolution in this organization where they had a new framework for addressing Israel-Palestine, which was apartheid. And so I think that work that he did is incredibly important. So I'm not only advocating for storytelling, but for those who are interested in storytelling, I think that the most important thing, I believe, is to get every detail right, to tell a very, very specific story without having to resort to jargon or concepts, or to really ground it as much as possible, to make it unassailable for any person who's reading it. You don't need to already be in a community of people who understands a set of words that only this community understands. And so, because for me, the aim with this book was to try and reach people who didn't even care about Israel-Palestine, who couldn't put Israel-Palestine on a map, I was very intent on making it a very human story. But there are all kinds of stories that to be told, and not everybody has to do this kind.
Hi, hello. I have 2 points to make. One is on the tolerance to the genocide. The other one is about UNRWA. Do you think the Israeli government was surprised they could go so far, bombing newly born babies, starving the civilian population, and they didn't expect this from the beginning, and so they were encouraged to carry on because of a lack of response? And for the American government, it's not surprising, but for the European governments, it surprised me. So why do you think this is, especially for Europe? And do you think this has encouraged the Israeli government to continue in its atrocities? And they didn't expect this at the beginning. That's one. Number two, about UNRWA. Is there any truth in the accusation, like 12 members were in the October 7th attacks? And if there is no truth in that, couldn't they think of a more plausible reason to attack UNRWA instead of these incredible accusations?
So, with respect to UNRWA, I believe, they have been launching a campaign against UNRWA well before October 7th, and this claim of participation by some UNRWA employees in October 7th is not the sole argument that they're making for shutting down UNRWA. Well, as far as the truth of the claim is, UNRWA has, I think, 13,000 employees in Gaza, are some of them members of Hamas? Sure. Are some of them members of Fatah? Sure. With respect to the specific charges in that case, they did an internal investigation. I can't remember. I know that there's some number where they said that there was no evidence of it. Some number, I believe I don't want to misspeak, but I do believe that one of those investigations, I think there were 2 press releases that they issued on it, and one of them, I think they found some evidence and they fired, or at least they claimed that they found evidence and they fired people. But again, we're talking about 19, and it's a fraction of those 19 that were accused that they found anything out of 13,000. And again, this is one of the biggest employers in Gaza, and I believe that UNRWA is doing all the kind of transparency and vetting whenever they're hiring anyone that they can. So, it's a failure on Israel's part that they didn't tell UNRWA to fire X, Y, and Z, because UNRWA listens to them when they do tell them to fire people. I'm saying prior to October 7th. With respect to the first question, I have to say I'm not surprised. I mean, it's awful and it's unjustifiable, but did I think that, you know, oh, there's some clear, you know, red line for Europe and the U.S. with respect to their support for Israel, and, you know, if Israel crosses that line, then that support would disappear. No, I didn't think that, and that's the sad truth. I really I think that there's no depths to which Israel can go and will lose U.S. support.
Before we break, and before I thank you, just want to remind everyone that we will have a reception right outside here, and Nathan will sit at the table and sign books for anyone who wishes. Nathan, we're incredibly fortunate to have you. We're incredibly fortunate to have you with us today.
I'm so pleased to be here.
We're incredibly fortunate to have you, period. You are an incredible person with incredible courage and an incredible talent to tell a story that, you know, hits deep with people like me and like all of us who are here. And, you know, as a great writer does, you know, I'm reading this and I'm like, he wrote it for me. And I know that everybody who reads it feels the same way. The work that you do is so incredibly important. And I know I speak for tons of people when I say we're very grateful to you.
Thank you, Safwan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.